Prickly Pears, Portraits of Historical Palm Springs. To savor and preserve our Palm Springs heritage, in 1986, the Palm Springs Public Library began to interview many of the early residents of Palm Springs. The project was funded by a grant from the McCallum Desert Foundation. Since then, we have returned many times to the Palm Springs of 40, 50, and even 60 years ago. There are some memories and sentiments common to everyone we talked to who had lived in the village. There were some differences of opinion, too. Our pioneers are a diverse group. But whether their forebears lived among these canyons 500 years ago or our more recent transplants from other places, they, like the prickly pear, all became hardy survivors of the desert. What follows are brief clips excerpted from the more than 50 hours of videotapes recorded since June 1986. They are available for viewing from the Palm Springs Public Library. The Agua Caliente band of the Cahuilla tribe has been in the Coachella Valley for over 500 years. Eileen Miguel is a descendant of the Potencio family and former head of the tribal council.
In 1951, when my grandfather, Albert Potencio, passed away, then at that time, traditionally, he was more or less what they called the leader of the tribe, not of the tribal council, but just the most highly respected one. And so after that, it went to Joe Potencio. And so I was at my aunt's home one day after my grandfather had died, before we had buried him, and he came and talked to my aunt and said, you know, what do you think we should do? Because he said the younger generation are all intermarrying, and the language is gone. Even his own children don't speak it. And there was just, I guess in his heart, he knew that it couldn't be carried on because they wouldn't know what to do. And so he came to my aunt because she was older than he was. And so it was the decision of the two of them then that everything ceremoniously that they use, whatever artifacts they were and all, were to be buried with my grandfather, and then our tradition would end then. And then the ceremony house, the big house, would be burnt down.
Francisco Potencio, venerated tribal chief, and Jim Maynard, great friend of the Agua Calientes, are remembered by Frank Bogert, now mayor of Palm Springs.
And Jim took me to the ceremonies they had. The ceremony they had for when people die, you know, it was they'd have a ceremony at the Little Indian Roundhouse, and they had it every 2 years, and it was to celebrate all the deaths of all the people that there in the net, who was old Potencio. After this thing went on all night long, it was a long ceremony, he would tell everybody, now go and don't mention these people anymore. And that's one reason today when you ask people who their father was or their grandfather, they don't know, because they were told by the net, who was the ceremonial chief of the clan here, to not ever mention those people anymore. I didn't realize for many years why people wouldn't tell me who their grandfather was or their ancestors. They were told not to, you know. And Mrs. Martinez is about the only one that I could get anything out, because enough time had left from the old ceremonies that she'll tell you now who everybody was. And
was that Francisco Potencio?
Yeah.
He was kind of the spiritual leader.
He was the spiritual. The most important one was what they called the net. And he was in charge of all the ceremonies in the little round.
William Veith was the Indian agent during the 1940s. He and his wife, Clara, lived next door to the mud baths on Section 14.
It was the hot pool, of course, was the natural hot pool that had come up out of the ground, and they had built this square, almost a square building, wooden building, around this pool, and the inside was divided into 4 sections. There was 2 cross sections in it, 4 places so that 4 people could take a bath at the same time into the hot water. And we had an Indian girl that had charge of the bathhouse under Bill's supervision, of course. And then we also had a masseuse that was there that took special appointments for a masseuse. But we had the Indians use the bathhouse, the working people used the bathhouse, we had regular residents use the bathhouse, and then of course we had quite a few celebrities that used to come in and use the bathhouse.
Do you remember?
Whenever they had a funeral, you know, they would take a week for the funeral, and they called that the wake, you know.
Yes.
I don't know whether you know that or not, but you do, all right. Then and they invite the Indians from the other people to come here, and they feed them and everything. And he sings all the time. Joe Potencio sings the chants all the time. I don't know what he said, but he can sing for a whole week.
Yeah.
We talked to and heard about people who have been here since the 1910s and 20s, many of whose histories are already familiar to us. Henrietta Parker, at 94, was the oldest pioneer we spoke to. She came to Palm Springs in 1914 and worked for Carl Licken in his store post office.
And what did you do in the post office?
I just took care of any of the mail that was like stamping the letters and the
General
window.
clerk.
Took care of the windows. And in 29, I was fired. You know why?
I want to hear that
government-
story.
Well, before, up to that time, it had just been, I don't know what, a little post office, and then it became a government post office. And they had the same rules as Navy and Army. You had to be 5'4" tall. And I was only 5'2". So they thought my brains was in my height, I guess.
A true original was Zadie Bunker, Henrietta's sister. Zadie became the first woman in California to be awarded a chauffeur's license. She and her husband operated the first garage in town, opened about 1913. Gail Thompson, long a photographer here, knew Zadie.
She said, "I'll be right out." And there she comes out on her, laying on her back with a big pipe wrench in her hand, on her hands and knees and in coveralls, and a bandana or something like that around her head. And I thought, my gosh, what's all this coming out underneath that building?
Carl Licken, a real force in early Palm Springs, is remembered by his daughter, Jane Hoff.
He came in 13, as I said, and then in 1915, he became postmaster and served under 3 presidents. It was Wilson, Harding, and Coolidge. And he served until 1930, which was 15 years. And he was a merchant for 30 years. And he was the Western Union representative for approximately 12 or 13 years. He was probably the first notary public because he started in 1914 until 1917. He was on the school board starting in 1915, community church elder starting in 1917. For 40 years he did that. And he was clerk of the session for 35 years. And he was a past president of the first police commission, the fire and sanitary commission, the Rotary Club, the Chamber of Commerce, the Community Chest, the Desert Museum, and the Riverside County Council of Boy Scouts, the Desert Riders, and he was the chairman of the Palm Springs Historical Society in 1957.
Born in 1919, Ted McKinney was the first white child born here. Ted's parents, Rose and Oliver, started a nursery business and planted some of the first downtown palm trees.
Just before they moved down here, I remember Mrs. Gillette coming by and seeing some Joshua trees and yucca trees and some barrel cactus there. And this is King Gillette's wife. They were just moving up in the Palm Canyon Mesa tract. And because we didn't have any running water, and these were the only plants that didn't take much water, why, we had him out in the front yard, or my mother and dad did, and she noticed him, and she had him bring in some plants for her. And this is the way that my father and mother got started in the desert nursery business.
Ted's sister, Barbara Moore, born here a little later, remembers.
You know, there was quite a lot of agriculture. We had a 4-inch pipe running across Palm Canyon out here from Tockwitz. We had a ditch down, and then it was piped under the road. And when we had campsites and eventually a trailer park at 634 South Palm Canyon, sometimes in the morning when the water would be running and full and cold, we'd find trout on the lawn flipping, just small ones, but there were actually trout on our lawn.
Alva Hicks was a builder-developer who came here early. By the mid-20s, his Palm Springs Water Company was supplying water to the village. His son Harold, who later ran the business, recalls the desert as it looked and felt.
I remember one evening I saw these horses all going slowly to their stable, maybe 40 or 30 or 40 from different homes, slowly going to these stables, which were rather in a central location. The sun was setting, and the purple mountains were up above. And it was a beautiful rhythm of a quiet, perfect day.
A name synonymous with early Palm Springs was Mother Nellie Coffman, who built the Desert Inn. Frank Bogert says it was she who really nurtured the tourist industry.
And Mother Coffman was the sweetest, nicest little old gal that ever lived, and really was the biggest power in the town. If Mother Coffman wanted something, I'll guarantee it happened. And if she raised hell about something, why, something was done about it.
One of the people most closely linked to the history of Palm Springs is Auntie Pearl McManus. Daughter of the first white settler, Judge John G. McCallum, Auntie Pearl founded the tennis club, but is better remembered for her many philanthropic projects. Her friend Peg Wallace describes her.
Well, she was very opinionated, and she was informed us when we started to build the house. Father drew what he wanted to show her what it was going to be. And she said, well, I don't like it at all. And Daddy says, well, I'm sorry I bought the property, and you are going to have to like it. No, I was very fond of Auntie Pearl, but she was very sharp.
One of strong opinions.
Very strong opinions.
Dr. J.J. Coker was one of the first doctors in town, and pioneers and villagers greatly respected him. Phil Boyd, Palm Springs' first mayor, tells us why.
For some of the community leaders that you remember in those first 2 or 3 years?
There's one man who isn't mentioned often enough that I praise as a very fine and important individual in the early days of Palm Springs. His name is Dr. Coker, K-O-C-H-E-R, the only doctor in the community. His office was right across from the Desert Inn, and the rear of an adobe building. The front of the building was a little drugstore where his wife sold merchandise, drugs, and filled prescriptions. But Dr. Coker looked after the Indians and looked after all the people who cared to have his advice. He had a Swiss background and was really a very fine man, became one of my closest friends. We later on traveled in Europe together.
Most Palm Springs visitors and residents know Cornelia White's little house, now on Palm Canyon Drive. Grace and Winfield Line remember her.
Well, of course, as you know, she always wore these puttees, and she once told Grace that I don't believe I should go to church because I think of...
I don't have a dress,
she said. She didn't have a dress,
yeah.
But she felt that way, but she never wore anything else.
By 1886, Dr. Wellwood Murray had built the Palm Springs Hotel in what was then called Palm Valley. Prospectors, developers, and people interested in the region's salutary effects on their health stayed there for the next 40 years. Dentist Bernie Polyak relates a little anecdote about this colorful citizen.
Story. It was told to me by Earl Coffman, who was the late Earl Coffman, who was the son of Nellie Coffman, and he was the father of Betty Kiley, who most of you know now. And the elderly Dr. Wellwood Murray he was here because of tuberculosis. He had tuberculosis, and I think he'd come to the desert for that reason. And he had a great white beard, so I was told, and he liked to nip wine once in a while, but his wife was violently opposed to any liquor of any alcohol of any form passing anyone's lips, especially her husband's. So while she was out, he had a bottle of red wine hidden in the place, and he would nip. One day he was just nipping out of the bottle of his red wine, and he heard the door open. And it was his wife coming in, so in his hurry to get the bottle down and hide it, some red wine spilled down his beard. And she came in and saw the red wine down his beard, thinking it was blood, and then that he was having an episode of his tuberculosis, coughing up blood. So she put him to bed and kept him there, and of course he was afraid to say anything.
Some of the most fascinating tapes we have are those made by families, sons interviewing parents who in this way have passed along their stories to succeeding generations. Ken Brott, born in Palm Springs, interviewed his mother Adele Lynch Brott and her sister Dorothy Lynch Manthe. The Lynch sisters came to the village in 1916.
Well, the same people in your class or in the school at the
Well, they're all like Ted McKinney and Milton Hicks, and so many of them are passed on.
Milt Hicks used to take you on his burro, didn't he, to school?
Yeah.
Who did?
Milt Hicks.
Milt.
Yeah.
He was my boyfriend.
See?
In fact, he was my boyfriend later on after I was quite grown, and he was going to Santa Clara. Okay, honey.
Who?
Mike Youngberg with his grandfather, Elmo Pernell.
He used to love your horses. The only horses we could ride. How did Los Compadres tie in with Desert Circus, or did it at all? Or
Well, we didn't work on the desert too much, except we rode it in the parade. We had what we call Western Week. That's the first decision. In September, October, we'd have a parade, sometimes a rodeo, barbecue, street dances, kangaroo court. That's where we got our start and made the money to buy the land here in the clubhouse.
sounds like fun?
Dr. Dan Kaplan reminisced with his father, Dr. George Kaplan, about early days of Palm Springs medicine.
Another archaeological remnant of the past is something called a house call. Did you gentlemen make house calls years ago?
My goodness.
Dad, did you ever make a house call in your life?
Oh, yes, I certainly did. I made, for many years, I went to the homes of patients and treated them as much as I could.
What did you do for examination and one of the mainstays, of course, of cardiology, still is, but in those days was electrocardiography. How'd you manage?
Well, I had a very an electrocardiographic machine, electrocardiograph, but it had two parts. One was a pretty good-sized part, and the other one was a little smaller. And I used to, before Dan came here, I used to take that by myself and take that to the homes of some of the people that were sick in order to get a cardiogram from them.
Dr. Eric Williams talked with his father and uncle, Stuart and Roger Williams, architects here for over 50 years.
And I might say that there was absolutely, you know, some people talk about the Spanish influence in California. Well, the Spaniards somehow overlooked Palm Springs. There never was a Spaniard here, and there was never a mission, and the Indian tribes certainly had no love for the Spaniards. So there was no Spanish tradition whatsoever in Palm Springs.
Oh, the Desert Inn was
and the Desert Inn was just a big, beautiful big, huge room with big hand-hewn beams and a tile roof, which was a very tiles a very excellent material used in the desert. It lasts forever. But there was certainly no Spanish tradition, and the fact that my father went to Santa Barbara and brought some of the early Spanish down here, I think that's about the beginning and the end of the Spanish tradition as far as Palm Springs is concerned.
Histories not as well known to us were revealed in our conversations with members of the Black and Mexican American communities. Mei Crawford came to Palm Springs with her husband in 1942 and lived on the reservation parcel known as Section 14 until they had to leave.
A lot of some blacks we observed came out here, and they were very disillusioned because of racism and restrictive land covenants and a number of problems of this sort here.
They couldn't buy no land any place, and they come down and it's going to shove us off of Section 14. That's the word we use. But we didn't have anywhere to go, and they wouldn't sell us any land. So then we started hunting. They says Garnett, and then they say the North End, which this was called the North End where I am right now, and then out across the track, which is about 6 or 7 miles east of here.
Lloyd Thomas also came here in the 40s. A porter at the airport, he has seen many fascinating travelers as the resort city grew.
When people like Louis Armstrong or other entertainers came here.
Well, they had to stay on the reservation, some of them did.
I see. Or in the Crossley?
Yeah, Crossley track. Later on, they fixed the place. Mr. Schumann fixed the place back in the back there, at the Chi-Chi. Chi-Chi, we had one big nightclub here. Ella Fitzgerald, all the Ethel Kitt, Mill Brothers, they'd all come in there and play, but they'd stay back in there upstairs. That was
Lawrence Crosley, who built the first golf course in Palm Springs for the El Mirador Hotel, is remembered by Culver Nichols.
A very fine black man, Lawrence Crosley, who deserves to be recognized as one of the true pioneers here in Palm Springs.
Lawrence Crosley.
The Crosley Road is named for him, and he was here from the early 20s and built the El Mirador golf course and for P.T. Stevens and operated it. And yes, he was really a great...
Peggy Prieto Ortega, her sister Ginny Prieto Canales, and their sister-in-law Vicki Ortega Reyes were with families who settled in Palm Springs in the 20s.
And when you came here, where did you live? Where did you settle down?
Well, you know where the Ralph's Market is now?
Yes,
right?
Yes. And where did you...
Out in the open.
Out in the open?
And I don't even remember if we had tents, do you?
He pitched a tent.
And pitched a tent.
And
there was water bubbling out of the ground there, so we had plenty of water. And right at the foot of the mountain, actually, there was a row of, what were they? Alamo trees, or what do you call them, poplar trees? And that was our shade. My mother and my aunt, I think, used to do the cooking. Big old rocks. Oh, yeah.
Between 1924 and 1938, the year of incorporation, Palm Springs grew rapidly. Known as the Village, its civic and cultural growth was shaped by some very special citizens. The need for water and efforts to channel it go back to earliest times. Giller Boyd, present chairman and longtime Desert Water Agency board member, describes the Hicks family Palm Springs Water Company.
Pearl's father brought a water in a flume ditch, open ditch from Whitewater. That was used primarily for agriculture. I believe they had 1 or 2 wells. The first person to go into what you might call a municipal water business was Alva Hicks, who owned the Palm Springs Water Company and also the Palm Springs Builder Supply. He got the water. His source of water was Snow Creek and Chino. And he brought water into town and put it into reservoirs up in the Little Tuscany area and distributed it throughout the town. And that grew over the years, and his son Harold Hicks and his son Milt Hicks ran it for many years. It was eventually taken over by the Desert Water Agency.
Land surveyor Jerry Sanborn was the first public works director. His son John, a civil engineer, recounts some of the history of local land development, beginning with the checkerboard.
But this had a kind of an odd effect on growth, didn't it?
Yes, it did, because the non-Indian land developed first, because title was easy to transfer. People could buy and sell it. You did not have to deal with the Indian Bureau. And in fact, it wasn't until, I guess, about 30 years ago, 35 years ago, that the federal government came in and actually allotted Indian land to individual Indians. I think it was right after, well, it was longer than, probably right after the Second World War.
Was it as difficult then to get your clearances and get things arranged?
No, no, it was pretty simple. You just went and did it.
Francis Crocker came to Palm Springs in 1932. An electrical engineer, he was the first person employed by the Nevada-California Electric Company, which originally brought electricity to the village. Mr. Crocker was on the first Board of Education, and he served on the library board for 41 years. He is also the father of the Palm Springs Tramway.
As we had, well, I was married to not only the power company, but the water, because I lived right over the, Rosalie and I lived upstairs, and that was the, we looked after what we could of the library and the power company all at the same time.
Culver Nichols, married to the daughter of pioneer developer P.T. Stevens, was himself a real estate developer in the 30s and active in many facets of Palm Springs growth.
Nick, did the first moves for incorporation grow out of the Chamber of Commerce? Was it kind of instrumental, or was it a different group to try to incorporate the city?
I would say yes. It grew out of this same group as Chamber of Commerce members and influential in the Chamber of Commerce, and recognizing that it was that there was the growth was such, and the recognition of the difficulty of dealing with government as far away as the county seat in Riverside, 50 miles over dubious roads, and so that the local business people felt that need, and particularly the hotel people, and decided that let's get our act together and let's incorporate this as a city. And they made a study of it, and they found out what the advantages and disadvantages might be, and how you did it, how you incorporated and so forth. You had a committee, so we had a committee. And
you, I believe, were a member of that committee.
I was on the committee, and so was Harold. So were the representatives of the big 5 hotels, and we were all, and the business people from downtown, and we were all on that committee, and we all had that purpose to incorporate the city of Palm Springs, to give us more local governmental control and a little better control of our tax dollars.
As the town grew, incorporation became an issue. Most residents voted in favor of incorporation in April 1938.
Did you find good support in the community for incorporation, or did you have to go out and do a little bit of a sales job?
We didn't have to sell it a darn bit. It was accepted as natural.
Some were not so sure.
What I remembered so well is what Mrs. Coffman said. She was against it. She said, "Gentlemen, what are you trying to do? Make this the biggest city in the world, 2 blocks wide?"
She was against it because of
well, she just thought I guess she had lived in towns I hadn't before there were cities. I didn't, the expenses and all that sort of thing of it, where we prepared.
How did you feel? How did you and your
Oh, I
husband
voted
feel?
against it, of course, and Mrs. Coffman did.
In 1921, Phil Boyd was attracted to the desert for health reasons. As shown in this honeymoon film, he and Dorothy were married in Palm Springs soon after. Both were active in the community, and Mr. Boyd became the first mayor.
What were your first goals when you became organized as a city?
I get back to, I think it was land use. I think we wanted a master plan of the development of the future growing Palm Springs. And we brought a man down from Santa Barbara who was a professional. I can't give you his name immediately. I do have his first design, because I have it in my office. He came down and he laid out the streets and where the streets ought to go, where ought to be an airport, there ought to be all of these different things, and limited to business district and residential district. And it was quite interesting. After a number of hearings, we adopted that.
How
You
large?
have to have a planning commission, you know.
Mrs. Boyd was intensely involved with the cultural development of the village. Her work with the library was a labor of love.
Lane's Library you were wondering about, it was started by a little group there in Palm Springs because these two teachers, sisters, had come to, because of health problems, to the desert, and there was no place for them to get reading matter. And at the time of the death of Eileen, her sister put $200 in Oahu Sugar Company as a memorial to her sister Eileen, and hoped that a library could be started. Now, Philip's mother had something to do with this, even the year before we were married, because I remember they went to the local church, which was a mission church at that time, and asked to be permitted to, if they would be permitted to put in a small structure, just a frame, wooden type, one room, on the back corner of the church property. And the church was delighted to have that. Books turned up from all directions, people who were glad to contribute. Our system, I became interested because of Philip's mother, who had poured tea at the opening tea party that was given for very few people. But I thought, well, I could certainly go down there and work out a system, knowing nothing about being a librarian, but with a card index, and all people would have to do when they came in and saw a book they wanted to take home was take out a card and sign it, and with the name and all the rest. And that's the way we functioned, with just an open door arrangement, that people could come in and get what books they wanted and sign for it. And this went on for quite a while. But it was named Elaine's Library because of the Oahu Sugar Company stock that we'd been given.
A vital cultural institution then and now was the Palm Springs Desert Museum. It was founded in 1938 as a natural history museum. Winfield and Dr. Grace Line took a keen interest in it.
But Mrs. Cockrell was having a hard time running the museum. The professor was old. He was the one who had the
husband.
Wonderful training, but
Yes.
she was the spark
She was the
plug,
driving
the dynamo.
force. She must have been very
yes,
dynamic.
and so
she was a
was.
former biology teacher.
Yes.
So she was interested in the
So
desert.
she was grabbing at anyone that could help her, and
Yes.
I was interested in nature, and so she would have me come down about 5 nights a week, talk to a little group, maybe 20 or 25 people.
Now, where was the museum located?
It was, at the first, it was in the library, the children's.
the
Then
back
it moved into a
children's
Quonset hut next door. And that was the place where I
And
was.
is that where you lectured?
Yes.
Ponce Hut
Yes.
and or in the children's
That's right.
wing of the library, which became a
And
museum.
sometimes we showed movies that we'd taken on the desert, and sometimes we just talked. And then,
You also conducted hikes. You were...
yes, I imagine that was under her program too, because I don't remember who, but both Grace and I would take, our favorite place was out almost to the bench in Palm Canyon, and then we went up a canyon to the left called Hidden Canyon to Dripping Springs.
Of course, it is the desert environment that makes Palm Springs unique. Many of our early residents not only understood its natural beauty, but used it creatively in landscape and architectural design. Pat Morton is a horticulturist and botanist.
You did Smoke Tree Ranch, which I think is extremely a pure example of desert landscaping. and
Keeping it
architecture.
true desert is very important, and that's what we promoted always, so that people would use desert plants, learn to live with and enjoy the desert. And of course, we did a lot of the original promotion work for Palm Springs itself, before there was even a Chamber of Commerce or a Convention Bureau or anything else. We worked with the El Mirador Hotel.
Earl Neal's parents came to the desert in a covered wagon in 1904. Since then, his family has been involved in horticulture through their business, Neal's Nurseries.
You also mentioned a major fire on Palm Canyon that seemingly destroyed the palm trees. But your father, of course, knew palm trees. He knew they would survive.
Yeah, it was quite a fire. Well, you could see that for hundreds of miles, that smoke going up there. It was really something, and there was no putting it out, because it was so hot you couldn't get near it, and it went through so fast. A palm tree with those skirts down is just like a chimney, and just that draft goes up, and boy, it just sends the sparks and everything.
This would have been in the 30s. And they then went on to survive. I have this picture of planting, I guess, more palm trees, or are these the... this is later.
The city planted all the trees on palm. We planted them, and
I see.
they were dedicated to my father. Ruth Hardy is the one, I think, that pushed that, really ran out to get the trees in. And
So we owe the present view of Palm Canyon to those plantings.
Albert Frey and John Porter Clark were the desert's first architects. Although they came from different traditions, they had a mutual respect for the desert, as evidenced by the John Clark House.
This is obviously starkly different than a smoke tree ranch house. Would either of you like to comment on the changes that are here that would be in contrast, let's say, to a ranch house?
I think in the first place it was elevated above the ground, which isn't quite the ranch type of thing. And I did that primarily so that I could retain a view of the mountains over the treetops, but the trees have now grown higher than the mountains. However, I still like them. But that was the basic reason for elevating it. And of course, again, this was the type of design that Albert had brought from the Le Corbusier office. He often built buildings on stilts.
That's right.
Albert, what would be some of the industrial resources that are here in the house, as opposed to, it is partially a wood frame, which is standard, but it's also...
But the facing, for instance, being corrugated metal.
Yes, I think that is.
And then the pipe supports.
Yes.
And pipe railing and so on.
And the roof fascias and that sort of thing.
Roger and Stuart Williams, with their father Harry, have played key roles in the architectural history of Palm Springs, from the plaza to the Desert Museum. Roger Williams speaks of the plaza, one of the first shopping centers in California.
I think it was Dr. White's cottage that was on the site. I think that's the one we disconnected from the chimney and put it up on a set of wheels. And as we build progressive different buildings of the whole plaza, they'd move us around. And this, I'd like to add a funny little item to this, because that house where the chimney had been was also half the bathroom. So when they pulled the house loose, that left half the bathroom open to the public. But it really didn't bother us that summer because it faced Palm Canyon. But a car would come down the highway maybe once every 2 hours, 3 hours, you never knew. But if you were taking a bath, you just tipped your head and they'd honk the horn. Very, very pleasant atmosphere, see?
Was the plaza actually at the center of the town?
It was. On one side was Indian Avenue, was a dirt road with beautiful trees hanging over it. And Palm Canyon was a little 2-lane pavement, blacktop road. And it was the first area that had internal parking off the streets. That was that first 2 little streets that connected Palm Canyon with Indian Avenue with on-site parking. And that was a new idea in California.
The unusual desert climate is an important factor in the history of Palm Springs. Everyone talks about the weather, and here, everyone with great invention did something about it.
July the 25th, June the 25th, 1925, it was 132. And why I remember that, Mr. Parker was putting a tar paper on the roof of the O'Donnell house up on the hill, and his feet blistered through his shoes. And they said, "What did you do?" And I said, "Well, I filled the tub was full of cold water as I could get, and we had a fan then, we had electricity then. And I said, I got my magazines and set the fan and got in the tub and laid there and read."
Humidity. So it was dry. The nights weren't that bad. Of course, our fathers built Ramadas right away.
Oh, tell me about
the palm fronds. They overlap them, made the
For shade, you know.
oh
like a
yeah,
porch.
made the shade,
And
that was cool. We ate underneath that.
Yeah.
And our beds were outside.
Sleep outside.
I remember we used to bury coffee cans, 4 of them, fill them with water, and put the bed, the posts in, so the ants wouldn't get us. They would drown. They wouldn't climb.
Harry's Palm Springs Cafe and Pool Hall boasted the first commercial air conditioning. Harry's son, Nick Mutagio Sr.
It's a well-known story that your father had the first air conditioning.
Yes.
And
my father had the first air conditioning.
Farsighted.
Yes.
Although it took a lot of care.
I say it was one of the first in a commercial building.
I see.
I don't know about homes at that time because there were a lot of wealthy people in Palm Springs at that time.
Yes. And this would be about 1935,
Yeah,
36,
around that time,
he
yeah.
brought in this mammoth monster.
The people loved it. It was cool in there. It took. My father told me it took it about 6 months to get all the bugs ironed out of it. It didn't run properly for a while, and then of course they straightened it out, and it ran excellent for years until we sold the place.
Talk of weather elicited memories of the famous flood of '38 from Louise Pernell.
Yeah, well, we were all shut off, both entrances to Palm Springs. You couldn't get in or out. And first the gas went off. And we lived in Hatchett's Court at the time. And so I had electric oven. So I cooked for everybody around in this electric oven. And then the electricity went off. And then one of the women had a wood stove in her cabin. So then we'd cook big pots of stew and things like that on the wood stove in the cabin. And of course no light, no electricity, no lights. So we sold, everybody was out of candles. All the stores were out of candles right away. So this friend of mine and I bought up all of the sealing wax in town. And we made candles out of that and sold them for $1.
With Earl Neal, we talked about wind and humidity.
We don't have half the wind that we used to. I remember probably 25 years ago when they first built the Whitewater Country Club, it blow for 75 days, and they never could run a sprinkler for 75 days. They have to lay the hoses down on the greens just to save them. And people say, oh, you don't blow it. You've forgotten that you can certainly stop the sand, but you can't stop the wind. But I think I really think that with all the growth we have now, with all the trees and everything, and that certainly breaks it up. And, but I don't know, the weather seemed it certainly changed, not only from the wind, but the moisture and everything. You hear a lot of people say, oh, with all this farming and the swimming pools and this making it so humid, that hasn't had one thing to do with maybe raise the humidity maybe 1%. When you have a humid day, you just look at the weather map and you see come right out of the Gulf of Mexico, come right out this way, and that's when it happens.
Some of the most active and involved residents were those who taught our children. The first school was located at the corner of what is now Indian and Amado. It was replaced in 1927 by the Francis Stevens School. All the people who attended one or the other school have fond memories of their school days. Catherine Finchy was an early teacher and eventually the principal of the Francis Stevens School. She is described by one of her students, Clarence Macy.
Magnificent. Catherine Finchy, don't ever sell her short. She was a tough old bird and she ran a tight ship, but it was a really happy ship. Those were the happiest days of any kid's life up there, but it was tough. And Miss Finchy was the boss, and we all knew it, but she went, as I say, above and beyond so many times to do so many things for us, and we must have gotten an education because we survived.
Vi Watson taught visitors' children at the Desert Inn.
And you taught all subjects? Or
yes, we had all the subjects. Used the California State School books.
And were the classes outside? For the
yes, it was all held in the Ramada. It was just beautiful. Glassed in on two sides and a big fireplace, so in the winter, the mornings, the boys would set a nice fire in the fireplace. It was just beautiful. The kids were just great.
And you probably had not just local kids, but visitors?
No, they were mainly visitors. That was the reason for the Desert Inn having this school. It invited the people to come from the east and the north to spend the winter and bring their children so they could go to school and carry on with their classes and go back to their own school then, and they wouldn't have lost any time.
Whose idea was this? Was this Nellie Coffman's?
Yes, Nellie Coffman's. It certainly was.
Betty Burnett taught at the Smoke Tree School. She speaks here with one of her former students, Rosine Supple.
It was on the guest ranch, and it was on the west border of the ranch, not far from the present gate, because the gate of that time was down on Highway 111.
Building?
3 buildings. We had 3 little buildings. There was the main building, and then there was the little adobe school, which was a darling little thing for the younger children. Then there was a thatched, sort of a playhouse there, and of course had a playground with swings and all that, and and only had morning classes because we could cover the work.
And you taught everything?
Yes, anything, whatever they wanted.
And
for any length of time, it didn't matter.
You had obviously a rapport with the kinds of education that they were getting back at home. They would bring their homework and
then we would.
And you would
keep them up in there, yes. It was sort of a multiple tutoring plan. All of them, no class.
Very individualized,
yes,
it sounds
yes.
as if.
I asked no questions. I asked no questions.
I was trying to remember you. I know you taught me French, but did you teach me math too?
The math was what we were working with, that your father was so interested in.
The Ortega Prieto family recalls their years at Francis Stevens.
And this Americanization room was right in the corner of, what was it, Alejo?
Alejo.
Alejo and Indian.
And we were almost corralled in there because we couldn't go to the other playground where the swings and the maples were. So we were right there. We stayed there. And by the time we got to the 4th grade, believe it or not, we could barely read or write. But we had a wonderful teacher, Miss Newberry, and she used to keep us after school. And I don't know if it hadn't been for Miss Newberry, probably we would never learn how to read. But she was a wonderful teacher. She
really was.
She taught us how to read, and she'd keep us after school. And so that was our Americanization, or being Americanized.
Paul Summers, the first science teacher, helped open the doors of Palm Springs High School in 1938. He wore many hats that first confusing year.
Yes, the high school opened and there were only 8 teachers and a teaching principal, and they tried their best to offer as enriched a program as possible, and virtually every one of the teachers had a full 7-period schedule of a different subject every hour, and my assignment was biology, general science for the freshmen and biology for the sophomores, physiology for some who had biology that didn't want to go to chemistry or physics, then chemistry and physics and photography, and I also got roped into journalism, middle of this thing.
One impetus for the settling and growth of the desert came from the curative powers of the climate and the hot springs. Judge McCallum and Wellwood Murray were both drawn here for those reasons. Dr. J.J. Coker, whom we have already met, was one of the first practicing medical doctors. Dr. Harry Reid came not long after. His office was called the Reid Solarium and Clinic. The sign out front advertised everything from x-ray to sun treatment. He also delivered babies. His nurse, the first in town, was Lina Wade, who came here in 1929.
Remember any of the babies that were born? Did the Indian population come to Dr. Reid's by any chance?
The reason Dr. Reid called in for a nurse, he needed a nurse badly because he delivered a lady with the name of Helen Williams, and her husband's name was Jack Williams, and we delivered Don Williams, and I believe Don's in the real estate business here in Palm Springs right now.
And that was the Dr. Reid Solarium?
That's right, at Dr. Reid.
Dr. William Elliot, a surgeon, has practiced here since the 40s. Dr. Elliot has some good stories about the early days of his medical practice.
And Mrs. Guggenheim was so badly injured that her husband wanted consultation for her injuries, and so Dr. Kaplan and another surgeon and myself were called in to take care of her, and we fortunately were able to help her, and she gradually got better. But Mr. Guggenheim, who was a rather firm gentleman, insisted that we have a conference every morning after we'd examined Mrs. Guggenheim. We'd have a conference and sit down, the 3 of us, and talk to him and discuss her condition. And this was a very formal affair, and we did that for about 3 weeks.
Well, Bill, we were lucky because she got well.
Yes, she did. I don't know what had happened to us if she hadn't. But
as the town grew, those who provided daily needs, food, shelter, and clothing, became more numerous and active. Don Williams, that baby born in Dr. Reid's clinic, became a real estate broker like his father.
Don, did your dad talk about whether it was tough to do business in those early days? Where did they find their customers?
Well, you know, it was interesting. Palm Springs in those early days was pretty much supported by about a half a dozen very wealthy people, millionaires in those days, that had homes here that would come out from back east and spend the winters here. And the whole economy just pretty much evolved around those 6 or 7 families that had homes here. The Burges were one of the and there was a Kellogg family who was had big holdings in the east that had a home here for the winter. And then, of course, a little later on, then the movie people started to come here, and of course it evolved very much around then with Charlie Farrell and Ralph Bellamy coming in and establishing the Racket Club. But that was
By 1929, it was apparent that a bank was needed. Fred Ingram, already an experienced banker, was called upon to run the first one, a branch of Bank of America.
Interesting note there, I remember Fred Ingram, who was an old-timer here and was a manager of the Bank of America. I can remember Mr. Ingram coming up there and telling the children about how to save money and how to go about it, and we would even make deposits, and he was just very interested in the young people and to see that they got off to the right start in their saving, and so that.
A well-known food store in the 30s was Sam and Leo's Deli, located in the plaza. The Leo was Leo Baker, who talks about his early days as a specialty food merchant.
How about your store? Did you find when you opened the store that the town was large enough to support it?
Yes, yes. We did quite a nice charge and delivery business. There were quite a number of homes at Smoke Tree Ranch, and we had most of the business there, and Las Palmas.
How about your customers? Who were some of the people that you catered to in those days?
Well, our very first customer that came in when we opened the store was Clark Abel.
Clark Abel.
And yeah, we had him autograph a dollar bill, which we framed, and we had many actors, actresses, and of course people out of those larger homes mostly.
One of the earliest grocery stores was Hatchett's, owned in the 30s by the Pernells, Elmo and Clarence.
Well, during the war, we sold everything we could get a hold of. I mean, they rationed butter and meat and eggs. And every time whenever we got it in, we always had a big rush. It was lined up for a block long to get meat every morning. And we only had enough meat to last about 2 or 3 hours, and then we'd be out. But one day, there was a truckload of meat tipped over on the highway out at Windy Point. It was going to the hospital, and they turned it down, but it was all wrapped in burlap, and it didn't get dirty. So we bought it, and we had meat for about a week after that. And we had big crowds every morning waiting for it. So it'd last, what we had cut up would last till about noon, and then we'd close up and start cutting for the next day. And we'd cut maybe meat all night.
Giller Boyd came here with his parents, the Florian Boyds. Florian Boyd was an accountant and a mayor of Palm Springs. Giller, also active in civic affairs, is a practicing attorney.
I'm thinking of the kinds of work that lawyers would have had to take care of in those days compared to what they do now. Was there, for example, very much criminal law? Were there
Not very much. No.
There wasn't much crime, was there?
No, there wasn't much crime. And of course, you didn't have the bureaucracy in those days you have now. You didn't have EIR, for example. That's a whole new field of law, the environmental law. There was no such thing as a conservationist in those days.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody worried about going out and uprooting a section of land, about disturbing a fringe-toed lizard, for example. Nobody ever heard of the doggone thing.
Sophie Maloof and her son Geri talk about the family clothing store that is celebrating its 50th anniversary in 1987.
Geri, when you began to work in the store, what were the principal kinds of things you carried in those days?
Well, the store made quite a few changes. The late 30s, or from 38 through about 1950, it was like a department store, men's, women's, children's, shoes, everything. And then and Western wear was big. And then we kind of changed our look after we moved into the the building on 186 South Palm Canyon Drive. We kind of changed our look there and went into just men's and men's and boys we had on one side of the store, and we had a lady shop next door.
Connie Ortega Perez came here with her parents in the 20s. Dressmaking was her love, and she worked in the apparel business for many years.
Mm-hmm. What were the styles when you first moved here?
Something like what I have on today.
Is that right? In 1928, it was, of course, the flapper era then.
Right.
And so,
the drop waist. In fact, I was going to wear one today, and I changed my mind.
Oh, goodness. Well,
the raglan sleeves. And of course, the tennis dresses were the thing. You could even walk downtown in a tennis dress and feel dressed.
Well, how long were the tennis dresses then?
Above the knee.
Above the knee.
Above the knee.
Right.
In fact, some of our skirts were also above the knee. We wore them quite
Pretty
shortly.
daring era, wasn't it?
Beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful.
As in most towns, the churches and temples of Palm Springs helped to establish a sense of community. The first church was built in 1912. Called the Community Church, it was non-denominational and served as a center of community life. One holiday, young Carolyn Summers helped out with Sunday school.
It was holiday time when I came and all, but I do remember one occasion when I was here. I guess we were here at Christmas time, and they asked me to take care of a Sunday school class at the little church, which is right at the corner of Amato Road and Palm Canyon, the only church in town. Well, I guess there was a Catholic church on the Indian reservation. So I'd never conducted a Sunday school class before, but I thought this is a cinch, and we did the reading and all with about 30 children in there, and then they wanted to sing. So I didn't know any hymns. I was raised a Unitarian, but I thought Home on the Range would be appropriate. So they thought that was wonderful, and they all joined in singing that. And some of the parents took that inopportune moment to come and visit the class. Came in, I think they were shocked. They thought it was pretty inappropriate for Sunday school, but I thought it fitted the desert.
The Catholic Church has a long history too. As early as 1912, many families worshipped at St. Florian's Catholic Church, now Our Lady of Guadalupe. The Purcell family, Dr. Frank and Evelyn, came here in 1943 and were members of Our Lady of Solitude Church. Their sons, Frank, Larry, and John, remember their Catholic educations shortly after St. Teresa's was founded in 1948.
Remember Sister Mary Lucia?
Yes.
Who was the principal of St. Teresa's until I was in, I think, second grade she left. She left right after you left. And absolutely a marvelous person. I remember Sister Daniels, who taught first grade. I think she was 178 when she was teaching me.
She was probably about 32 at the time.
She was also 3 foot 2 inches tall. She was just our height. She was a wonderful person.
You know, since this is a matter of historic record, I think it'd be good to mention too the Victory Knoll sisters, who I believe are still in the Coachella Valley, but when there was no Catholic institution other than the churches, they came and taught catechism in what was the main parish, Our Lady of Solitude. That's where I first, Frank, you must have, did you have any catechism stuff? Or you came from Indio, I guess, but.
Right, and my recollection was that on Saturdays we had catechism in the church.
Yes.
But it's been a long time.
The Jewish community has been an important facet of Palm Springs life since the 1940s. Hermine and Stan Rosine tell us how the Jewish Community Center started in a building owned by Erwin Schumann.
Well, he was kind enough to let us use the rooms, the guest rooms around this facility, which needed a lot of painting and a lot of cleaning, and pigeons had roosted in the loft over the living room and the kitchen and had made a horrible mess of things everywhere else around there. But this men's club now was called upon, and they proceeded to volunteer weekends and went down there and cleaned it all up and made a very comfortable and useful facility out of these rooms.
But dear, you're making it sound much too lovely. The kids referred to it as Spook Haven because the pigeons were still there and still dropping, and the parents who had allergic children were upset, and we had to pacify everybody, and it wasn't easy always.
No, but the volunteer effort was very satisfying. And so from that, the feeling of more people in the community, more children in the community, that it was time for us to be thinking about a permanent home and something a lot nicer than what we were presently using.
Bess and Irvin Matloff settled here in the 30s and became active members of the temple.
Yes, we started working on the Jewish Community Center, and we just had one room built when Paul was ready for bar mitzvah. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, I think that would be fascinating.
Okay, and he studied, we didn't have a rabbi then. We had a young man that knew his rabbinical services very well and teachings, and he taught Paul. And at that time, Paul was the first one to be bar mitzvah in that one room that was built in those years. We were very proud of that room. It was the only one we had. We used it for sanctuary. We used it for various other things that we did. But when he became bar mitzvah, it was a great thrill to us then.
Very much a part of Palm Springs history are the special citizens who were concerned for the welfare of others. Jo Henderson's mother, a registered nurse, was a quiet force behind many charitable causes.
Oh yes, if there was any problem, any kids being born or anything, she'd go out and, what do you call it, wet nurse them or whatever it is, and help them along, get them started, and get some money out of the county or something to feed them, and I know many times she dug in her own pocket too. But oh, she was quite a woman.
And the article I read said that she called on Mrs. Coffman at one point and told her about the need, and that.
Oh sure, and Nellie Coffman wouldn't back off from anybody. She just said, "Go get it, Harry. We'll take care of it." You know, she was a fine woman. I mean, she did a lot of charitable things that people never heard about.
Carolyn Summers has not only played a vital role in bringing a cultural dimension to Palm Springs, she has been at the forefront of charitable endeavors as well.
Well, the Welfare and Friendly Aid was originally a committee of caring women in the old days prior to 1930. And they would, family, an indigent family would become marooned in Palm Springs or end up here, and they would provide them with food and clothing and a place to stay. And finally, in 1941, Mrs. Thomas O'Donnell was president of the Women's Club, and she asked me to be chairman of a newly formed, I'll read part of this because I wrote it up for the Historical Society, of a newly formed section of the Welfare and Friendly Aid. With the financial support of Tom O'Donnell, we acquired land and built a health center on East Amato Road. A public health nurse was employed by the Riverside County to conduct the clinics there.
Estella Cummings was a longtime friend of Dottie Stein. Mrs. Stein owned Mary Helen's shop and was active in community service as a gray lady at Torney General Hospital.
Do you remember talking about civic-minded people, along with, certainly with Dorothy Boyd? Dottie was very involved in so many things. She started the Girl Scouts.
Yes. We all went to a planting of a tree for her when she was still alive.
How wonderful.
Not too long ago. I go past there every now and then. You know where the Girl Scout house is.
Yes, it's still there.
And there were 2 or 3 other people who were honored at the same time. And I've often thought I should go by and see if that thing is growing. It doesn't look like it is. It's to the south of the door.
Oh, I will have to look at it again.
And then another thing, which we didn't mention the other day, was how Dottie's activity with the nurses at the hospital.
Oh, she was a great lady.
Oh, she was more than that. She was head of the nurses at the
Torney General.
Yes.
Dr. Bernie Polyak, a dentist here for 40 years, told about the free dental service offered in the 40s.
Frank Purcell and I were the only two people here at the time. We took care of indigents. There were a number, but we set up a clinic to take care of children who were unable to pay. We got surplus dental equipment from Torney General Hospital and put it into a room of the Welfare and Friendly Aid Society, which was a volunteer women's group. It was the only social service agency in the area at the time. And they gave us room in a little building they had out in Section 14, and we set the dental equipment in there. And we examined all the children in the schools every year, and the ones who the schools determined weren't able to pay a fee for dentistry were taken care of there.
The daily events of Palm Springs were recorded and preserved with the help of telephone, telegraph, and camera. Merritt Williams was assistant postmaster to Carl Licken, and they operated the Western Union service.
We've known just about everything going on in town then, if you were taking all those messages.
I can remember just one, not the names or anything, or not exactly about it, but this fellow in New York, his girl was living at the Desert Inn, and he used to send her a wire about every day. It was regular love letters, what it was, see. So I used to take it down and type it and then go over and hand it to her. She never did realize, I don't think, that I
that you knew what it said.
Knew all of the messages, what they said.
In the early days, Carl Licken had the only phone as well.
Union. He bought the line from Dr. Murray, the only telephone line coming into Palm Springs, and you owned it, and it went over to the station at Garnet.
Priscilla and John Chafee founded the Limelight newspaper, which was a force in the growing town and helped lead the move toward incorporation. Irv Matloff was a photographer who captured on film those who were here in the desert as part of the war effort.
Irv, did you do work for General Patton?
Not for him directly, but General Patton had a sergeant major whose name was Man Mountain Dean. He was a squatty, very muscular, very large in his torso. And they wanted pictures of what was going on with the maneuvers. The pictures that I took were for the 777 Tank Destroyer Battalion. Gosh, it's a wonder I remember that.
Ever since Gail Thompson opened Gail's photography studio in 1945, there was rarely a major event, celebrity, or local dignitary he did not photograph.
One of our small restaurants down here and night spots was George and Ethel Strebe. That's one of his little race cars that one of his toys that George had, and Ethel in front of the dollhouse.
What a great picture.
Ethel was always admired for her legs. She had beautiful legs.
During Village days, the importance of the Southern Pacific Railroad with its stops outside of town declined. However, Jane Licken Hoff recalls the early railroad service.
And one day I went with them, and I was just a little girl, and they took me, they used to use extra engines, well they do today, to get the loads up the grade from Indio. And there was an extra engine there, so they asked me if I'd like to go for a ride. So I loved that, and a big old steam engine, you know. And I was so small that they had to lift me up because when we came back into the big Garnet station, which is about 40 by 40, they had to lift me up so I could ring the bell, you know. Ooh, kind of fun. Yeah, fine.
Well, I heard there was a railroad at one time from Garnet down to Smoke Tree.
There was. It was a colony that was started here back in the 1880s, some late 1880s, I guess, called Palmdale. And they built this little railroad, narrow gauge railroad, and I understand they had 2 little cars and a wood burning engine. The little cars came from San Francisco, and they still had the bells. Maybe they were regular street cars. I mean, cable cars. I don't know.
Zadie Bunker opened the first auto garage in 1913. Her sister, Henrietta Parker, describes Zadie when the garage was the only stop for motorists for miles around.
Oh, well, Zadie was really, there wasn't anything undertaken that she didn't try to do.
That's
She
right.
was a automobile mechanic. They didn't have hoists, you know, to raise cars up. They had a pit they dug, and they put the car over a pit. She'd get down in and repair cars, and she did a lot of driving for people, their cars.
She was
Other service stations followed. During the Depression, Earl Huff's station provided young villagers, including Joe Henderson, with jobs.
Yeah, he was quite a guy. Any kid that needed a job, they got a job. That was one of the things Earl did. And if they didn't have a place to stay, he'd take them home.
The improvement of the highway from here to Los Angeles was one of the most important reasons for the growth of Palm Springs, explains John Sanborn.
It was, I think the real thing that moved this valley was in the 20s when the Hollywood crowd found it as a getaway place. The road was paved to Palm Springs. The highway was built and the bridges, etc. And opened it up so it then was not a 8 or 9 hour drive from Los Angeles. It became, in those days, probably a 3-hour drive.
Clarence Macy has been a flyer for many years and observed firsthand the growing importance of airplanes to the desert.
Okay, the first airport that I used to walk up that dirt road just to peek in the windows of the hangar, see what's going on, was on Indian Avenue, north of the El Mirador Hotel, running east and west, north about where Paseo El Mirador is now, just a little bit north of that. Now here, this is the El Mirador complex. This is Indian Avenue running right up there, this little dirt road. There is the hangar for the airport, and there is an old biplane sitting on the field. Across the street is what I think we called the Stevens tract. It was just, you can see the ground has just been scratched. But this is the El Mirador, this is the main building, the lobby, and the tower is there. These are the 2 structures that later became hospital units when it was Attorney General Hospital and Palm Springs Hospital.
In pioneer days, entertainment was potluck dinners, horseback rides, and occasional trips to Garnet to watch the trains come in. No one was bored, though, as Theo McKinney Easterbrook testified.
In those days?
Oh, we made our own fun. My sister and I, we rode horseback. We had horses to ride. We could ride any place on the desert because there wasn't any buildings.
By the 30s, entertainment was more sophisticated, thanks in part to 2 men, Earl Strebe and Irwin Schumann. Irwin Schumann opened the most popular night spot. It was called the Chi-Chi, and Jack Freeman tells us why.
Irwin knew nothing about the restaurant business at all. His only connection with it was having eaten in one of them. And this Jack Church came there, and he was an artist, a caricaturist. He used to paint these caricatures. There may be some around Palm Springs, but these were the most interesting ones. They were all of Mexican peons. And he painted some of these in the patio of the Freeman's Desert Grill and what he got. And of course, first I must predicate the whole thing. I'm sure the audience know by now what chichi means in Spanish. Had great big bosoms, which were known as chichis in Spanish. In the meantime, Jack Church was drinking. He ran up a bill. So Irwin said, I'll tell you what I'll do. From painting all of these in the men's room and the ladies' room, he had these all over, and they evoked many comments. And he says, we'll call our bill square. And Jack Church says, well, why don't you rename this place the Chi-Chi? And Irwin says, yes, I will. That's how it got its name, Chi-Chi.
Jack Freeman has been in the restaurant business here since 1934. He told us about the gambling houses here and in Cathedral City.
No, I wasn't there opening night. No, as a matter of fact, no one from town other than like Earl Coffman, George Robinson, Warren Penny, they were the owners of the Desert Inn and the El Mirador, and Tom Lips. Only a few of the people, the very prominent people, and they weren't allowed to gamble.
I see.
One of the deals he made, I guess, with the sheriff was that no local people would gamble out there. That's one of the conditions that the sheriff's department allowed him to open, that all the money that was lost out there would come from the outsiders. That meant there would be no protesting by the local people, which was good politics.
Earl Streby's Plaza Theater opened in 1936 with the feature film Camille.
Yeah, in 1936, Dr. Coker, who was one of the pioneers in Palm Springs, decided he was going to take all of his Coker's babies to the opening of the Plaza Theater, which featured Camille. That night before the opening, we had dinner with Nellie Coffman at the Desert Inn Hotel, and from there we walked across the street to the Plaza and were entertained with the opening of Camille with Robert Taylor and Greta Garbo. Very interesting.
Radio shows were broadcast from the theater too, as Nick Mataccio recalls.
Not Bob Hope. Jack Benny started coming down here to make his shows, the radio shows. And there was a couple that were held in the American Legion. Then most of them moved down to the Plaza Theater, which was much more suitable for that type of entertainment. Bob Hope put on shows. Bing Crosby came down with shows. And in the earlier years, the Amos and Andy show was broadcast from the El Mirador.
Yes. Celebrities were frequently seen on the streets and in the hotels.
And here was this lovely village with hibiscus and trees and greenery and movie stars tripping up and down the sand. And I thought, man, is this heaven? See, I thought, this is it. So,
and of course, there was the Desert Circus, as Frank Bogert recalls.
Al Wertheimer called all the people in town to get together to raise money for the Catholic Church, to build a Catholic church on the reservation where the Our Lady of the Guadalupe is. Had a little bitty church and they wanted to build him a bigger one. So he had Father Lehane, who was the local priest, and Earl Strebe and Earl Coffman and George Robeson and and me and Trav Rogers, I think, were all the people at that meeting. And we decided to put on an event to raise funds for the church. And we charged admission to it and had several events.
The desert atmosphere has always encouraged outdoor recreation. Many years, horseback riding was the favorite form of outdoor activity, and many social clubs such as Desert Riders and Los Compadres developed from the community-wide love of horses. Frank Bogert.
But the interesting thing is that in the early days, cowboys all were very part of the social life of Palm Springs. And I used to go, for instance, every night I'd go to El Mirador promoting horseback rides, and Cliff Fregger, he'd get all dressed up and go up to the Desert Inn and promote rides, and every party you'd go to would be, there'd always be a lot of the local cowboys there, you know.
Golf, too, has been important since the early days. The O'Donnell course was home turf to many local players and prominent visitors. Larry Sitter managed O'Donnell.
Well, like I say, the golf course was built in the late 20s, so it must have been not much earlier than that, when he leased the property up there from Nellie Coffman and built his home there.
How many members were there when you arrived?
We always, actually it wasn't really a membership club then. It was the only golf course, so most all the hotel
everybody just played
guests and the times it got very, very crowded.
I see. So it really wasn't a private club?
No, it wasn't then. No, not that time. It wasn't private until after Mr. O'Donnell gave it to the group and leased it to the city.
One of the world's best-known caddies was George Scorpy Doyle, also a part of the O'Donnell staff for years.
You said that George the Greek, what was his real name?
George Zerganalis.
George Zerganalis.
He had a little hotel there, Athens, right across the street from the phone.
But he often had very colorful language for certain golf terms.
Well, no, it was just his own language, but it knocks you out of the box, you know. A lot of people don't understand, you know, golf cracks, like if you're playing in a golf tournament, you know, you've got to take your turn, you know, to putt. Or if you're away, you know, some say, you're away, but the Greek would say, it's your dice. I see. That's, to me, I told that to Hope fell down.
The opening of the Racket Club in 1934 brought tennis into prominence. But Alice Marble, holder of many world titles, remembers the court at the Desert Inn in 1931.
You first came to Palm Springs in 1931, and what were the circumstances of that?
Oh, that's such a cute story. Teach Tennant, who's been a great part of my life, and you'll hear more about Teach. She'd been hostess at the Beverly Hills Hotel and also taught tennis there. And she met all these Eastern people who come out for the winter, and Teach was invited to the old Desert Inn for the weekend, and she brought me down with her. And of course, I guess they went in and played bridge, and I got the pro and hit balls. I was runner-up at the national championship. I didn't win because I didn't know about playing on grass, and I had all the wrong grips. So I was hitting with the pro, and a little girl came up, about 6 years old, riding a kind of a kid's bicycle. And she said, I bet you can't play tennis on a bicycle. And I said, of course I could. So the pro got the PR lady with the photographer and took pictures. And 40 years later, I went to the UN in New York, and somebody said to this woman, do you know Alice Marble? And she said, yes, she can play tennis on a bicycle. And it was Shirley Temple.
Most of the people we've talked to have been permanent residents, but there were many who wintered here, who also contributed to the community by making Palm Springs a premier vacation spot. Vi Watson remembers two of the best-known Palm Springs hotels.
The Desert Inn was the quality hotel in Palm Springs, the hotel. The El Mirador was for the movie stars and the newly rich and so forth, but quality people, the very wealthy people, all stayed at the Desert Inn, very quiet.
In 1919, Peg Wallace first wintered in the desert with her parents.
So I came down here and I spent the whole year and went back in May, later April, and Auntie Pearl and Marjorie and Uncle Austin gave a dance for me on top of what is now Robeson's jewelry. And that was the office.
For people who might not know, where is that located?
Well, it's located about 200 yards from the corner of Talcott's McCallum and Palm Canyon. And that was near the old adobe where Auntie Pearl lived.
And she gave a dance for you on the roof?
On the roof, and she used a old wheelbarrow for a brazier, and we had the Victrola and danced up on top of the roof.
That's marvelous. Who were some of the people who came to share that
Well,
with you?
there was Phil Boyd, who was our first mayor, but he wasn't mayor then, and Charlotte Mathewson, and of course Marjorie, and Freddie Watson, and Marion Fulford and Ted, and let me see, there was the young, quite a few of the, well, there were the Jim and Maury Gagey, and Jim became manager of the Desert Inn.
The Racket Club, of course, has been a Palm Springs institution since 1934. Doris and Walter Marks were charter members.
I wanted to ask you how you got, speaking of clubs, how you got involved in the Racket Club. You were a very early member of the Racket Club. You were number three.
And I think I showed you my card.
Right.
And the reason I was an early member, because I played tennis with Charlie Butterworth.
Charlie Farrell.
Charlie Farrell, I should say. And in Beverly Hills, when they were organizing it, Ralph Bellamy. So I said, I'll join. I like Palm Springs. And I bought the 40 acres adjoining the Racket Club on the north. I said, I'll build some houses and we'll get a colony there.
Was that your first land development in Palm Springs?
In Palm Springs, yes.
First,
Joan Toohey's grandparents were frequent visitors to the desert as far back as 1921. She remembers the mud baths.
And mother and father used to take them. I think maybe after a night gambling and a little bit of something else. And so they would always tell us about the mud baths and how relaxing they were. And so I always loved to try something different. So they took us down, but
It's like a sauna, either you love it or you don't.
well, sauna's all right. That's clean, but the mud, I didn't.
After World War II, Palm Springs emerged from a small village to a burgeoning, world-renowned resort and permanent home for a sizable population. Even by 1941, the town and the desert area were focal points for the war effort. Hazel Critchlow staffed the desk of the Chamber of Commerce in the 30s, but she best remembers the war years and her job as official driver for Army brass stationed here.
But anyway, they got a call and he said, "Sergeant, do you have," I could hear it, or he repeated it like it was, "Do you have a gray-haired lady down there in the motor pool?" And I had white hair because my mother said that a couple of days after my husband died, suddenly overnight with double lobar pneumonia, I was white. And I don't remember that, but she said my hair was white. Well, anyway, they said, yes, we do have a lady, and the rest were all quite young, some girls and some soldiers. And so I was hired.
Bess Matloff recalls the activities surrounding Tourney General, the military hospital converted from the El Mirador Hotel.
Bess, what did you personally do as part of that operation?
I drove, at that time, in the motor car, drove an ambulance.
And what did they teach you? I mean, this
No,
is
they
fascinating.
taught you how to handle an ambulance. We had to drive up to Idlewild, and when we could turn in the middle of one of these narrow roads going up to Idlewild in those years, when we could turn our ambulance, the sergeant would say, "Stop, turn," and he'd have both feet on the brakes and both hands on the brakes because the drop was so tremendous, and if you didn't stop, he'd hold back. And then we turned the ambulance around and come down. When you passed that test, you became a driver.
Nick Mutaggio says the war changed Palm Springs.
It overwhelmed the town logistically, as you know, food and places to stay, you know. And of course, then we had, a lot of people don't understand that too. The only thing they remember is that Patton was here. We had an air base here. Our local airport was an air transport command when there were quite a few soldiers here.
Clarence Macy has talked.
And we also had the
that.
hospital, the Tourney General
Tourney
Hospital,
General,
the old El Mirador.
Yes.
And there was a lot of military people in town.
Yes.
And they had to have places to stay and places to eat. And the town was sort of thriving during the war. They had a good economy. Money was moving.
Yeah. World War II was the end of the village era. Culver Nichols looks back across those early years and shares his thoughts with us.
What do you think of it?
I think Palm Springs is really great. It's it has carried on that kind of tradition of trying to be excellent and have a kind of a human refinement about it that really is part of the dignity of being a person, and knowing something about yourself, and this means knowing your community and being a part of it and striving to help its development and your development together in meaningful ways. And I think that Palm Springs has largely fulfilled those dreams, if they were, or ambitions, or whatever they were, for many people. Many of the people I have mentioned and have known here, I think deserve credit in the stream of credits for the development of Palm Springs.